Hello friends, welcome to my YouTube channel Vision Innovative. If you are not subscribed my channel, please subscribe and press the bell icon for the latest video notification. So today we are going to discuss about the ancient Inca civilization cities in the cloud. In the year 1911, the young explorer Hiram Bingham was exploring the mountainous cloud forest of Peru. He was chasing a rumor that had been circulating for many years. A rumor that an entire lost city might lie somewhere high in the prevalent ends in a valley known as Urumbuba. Bingham was skeptical, but upon hearing a form of a local guide, he decided to climb to the top of the precarious mountain trail and investigate. The letter he wrote about how his journey unfolded. So lofty are the peaks on either side, although the trail was frequently shadowed by dense tropical jungle. Many of the mountains were capped with snow. There seemed to be little in the way of ruins, and I began to think that my time had been wasted. However, the view was magnificent. On all sides rose the magnificent peaks of the Urumba Canyon, while 2,000 feet below was the rushing water of the noisy river. Bingham climbed a little higher, hacking through the dense forest and fighting off the effects of the altitude sickness that would often creep upon travelers of the high passes of the Andes soon. He stormed across something that must have made his heart skip a bit. Presently we found ourselves in the midst of the tropical forest, beneath the shade of whose trees we could make out of maze of ancient walls. The ruins of buildings made of blocks of granite, some of which were beautifully fitted together in the most refined style of Inca architecture. Bingham was impressed, but the more of the explored, the more he realized that this was a mere scattering of ruins. A few roads further along, we come to a little stone space on which there were two splendid temples or places. The superior character of the stonework, the presence of these splendid edifices, and of what appeared to be an unusually large number of finely constructed stone dwellings led me to believe that this might prove to be the largest and most important ruin discovered in South America. His trick turned into a frantic scramble of scrambling ruins gave way to get more and more ruins, and it became clear that a large settlement did indeed lie here under the dense undergrowth. For an hour and 20 minutes. We had a hard climb. A good part of the distance we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails. Here and there a primitive ladder from the roughly notched trunk of a small tree was placed in such a way as to help one over what might otherwise have been an impossible cliff. The heat was excessive. The ruins that Bingham had discovered were the remains of a royal estate of the king of a people known as the Inca. It had been completely abandoned for nearly 4 centuries on the top of the craggy peaks of the Urumba Hill. Today it is one of the most recognizable and distinctive ruined places in the world, and it is known as Machu Picchu. It had once been an outpost of an empire that stretched right across the continent of South America and formed its most extensive and sophisticated civilization, an empire that had tamed one of the most hostile environments on earth over the following weeks and months, clearing away the vegetation and the rolled over these ancient walls. He must have asked himself, how would the people of this region build such a mighty fortress in the cloud? Machu Picchu stands 2,430 meters above sea level in the middle of a tropical mountain forest in an extraordinarily beautiful setting. It was probably the most amazing urban creation of the Inca Empire at its heights. Its giant walls, terraces, and ramps seem as if they have been cut naturally in the continuous rock escarpment. The natural setting on the eastern slopes of the Andes encompasses the upper Amazon basin with a rich diversity of flora and fauna. Briefly, synthesis. Embedded within a dramatic landscape at the meeting point between the Peruvian Andes and the Amazon basin, the historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu is among the greatest architectural and land use achievement anywhere and the most significant tangible legacy of the Inca civilization. Recognized for an outstanding culture and natural values, the mixed World Heritage property covers 32,592 hectares of mountain slopes, peaks and valleys surrounding its heart. The spectacular archaeological monument of a La Cuisdela at more than 2,400 meters above sea level. Built in the 15th century, Machu Picchu was abandoned when the Inca Empire was conquered by the Spaniards in the 16th century. It was not until 1911 that the archaeological complex was made known to the outside world. The approximately 200 structures making up the outstanding religious, ceremonial, astronomical, and agricultural center are set on a steep ridge, crisscrossed by stone terrace. Following a rigorous plan, the city is divided into a lower and upper part, separating the farming from residential areas with a large square between the two. To this day, many of Machu Picchu's mysteries remain unresolved, including the exact role it may have played in the Inca's sophisticated understanding of astronomy and domestication of wild plant species. The massive yet refined architecture of Machu Picchu blends exceptionally well with the stunning natural environment with which it is intricately linked. Numerous subsidiary centers, an extensive road and rail system, irrigation canals and agricultural terraces bear witness to long-standing, often ongoing human use. The rock topography making some areas difficult to access has resulted in a mosaic of used areas and diverse natural habitats. The eastern slopes of the tropical Andes, with its enormous gradient from high altitude Puna grassland and Polylapis thicket to mountain cloud forest all the way down towards the tropical lowland forest, are known to harbor a rich biodiversity and high endemism of global significance. Despite its small size, the property contributes to conserving a very rich habitat and species diversity with remarkable endemic and relict flora and fauna. The Inca city of historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu is the articulating center of its surroundings, a masterpiece of art, urbanism, architecture, and engineering of the Inca civilization. The working of the mountain at the foot of the Huayna Picchu is the exceptional result of integration with its environment, the result from a gigantic effort as if it were an extension of nature. The historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu is a unique testimony of the Inca civilization and shows a well-planned distribution of functions within space, territory control, and social productive, religious and administrative organization. The historic monuments and features in the historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu are embedded within a dramatic mountain landscape of exceptional science and geographical beauty, thereby providing an outstanding example of a long-standing, harmonious, and aesthetically stunning relationship between human culture and nature. covering part of the transition between the high Andes and the Amazon basin. The historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu shelters a remarkably diverse array of the microclimates, habitats, and species of flora and fauna with a high degree of endemism. The property is part of a larger area unanimously considered of global significance for biodiversity conservation. Integrity. The historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu meets the condition of integrity, as the natural and human-made attributes and values that sustain its outstanding universal value are mostly contained within its boundaries. The visual ensemble linking the main archaeological site of the historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu with its striking mountain environment remains mostly intact. It is desirable to extend the property to encompass an even broader spectrum of human-land relationships. Additional cultural sites such as Paisek and Ollantaytambo in the Scarred Valley and a larger part of the Urumba watershed would contribute to the strengthening the overall integrity. In particular, the value of conservation of the many rare and endemic species of flora and fauna would benefit from the inclusion or a stronger management consideration of the adjacent land. A considerable number of well-documented threats render the property vulnerable to losing its future integrity and will require permanent management attention. Authenticity. Upon the abandonment of the historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu at the beginning of the 16th century, vegetation growth and isolation ensured the conservation of the architectural attribute of the property. Although the design, material, and structures have suffered slight changes due to the decay of the fabric, the condition of the authenticity have not changed. The rediscovery in 1911, the subsequent archaeological excavation and conservation intervention have followed practice and international standards that have maintained the attribute of the property. Protection and management requirements. The state-owned historic sanctuary of the Machu Picchu is an integral part of Peru's national protected areas system and enjoys the protection through several layers of a comprehensive legal framework for both cultural and natural heritage. The boundaries of the historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu are clearly defined and the protected area is surrounded by a buffer zone exceeding the size of the property. The management unit of historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu was established in 1999 to lead the strategic content of the master plans, which are the regularly updated governing documents for the management of the property. UGM was reactivated in 2011 and is comprised of representatives of the Minister of Culture, Environment and Foreign Trade and Tourism, the regional government of Cusco, serving as the president of executive committee, and the local municipality of Machu Picchu, a platform bringing together key governmental representatives at all levels is indispensable for the management of a property which forms part of Peru's very identity and is the country's primary domestic and international tourist destination. Notwithstanding the adequate legislative and formal management framework, there are important challenges to the interinstitutional governance and the effectiveness of management and the protection of the property. The discussed legislation would benefit from further harmonization, and despite existing efforts, the involvement of various ministries and governmental level ranging from local to national remains a complex task, including in light of the sharing of the significant tourism revenues. Tourism itself represents a double-edged sword by providing economic benefits but also by resulting in major culture and ecological impacts. The strongly increasing number of visitors to the historic sanctuary of Machu Picchu must be matched by an adequate management regulating access, diversifying the offer and efforts to fully understand and minimize impacts. A larger, appropriate and increasing share of the significant tourism revenues could be reinvested in planning and management. The planning and organization of transportation and infrastructure construction, as well as the sanitary and safety conditions for both tourists and new residents attracted by the tourism, requires the creation of high quality and new long-term solutions and is a significant ongoing concern. Since the time of inscription, consistent concerns have been expressed about ecosystem degradation through logging, firewood and commercial plant collection, poor waste management, poaching, agricultural encroachment in the absence of clear land tenure arrangements, introduced species and water pollution from both urban waste and agrochemical is the Urumba River. In addition, from pressure derived from border development in the region. It is important to remember that the overall risk is aggravated by the location in a high altitude with extreme topography and weather conditions, and thus susceptibility to natural disasters. Continued efforts are needed to comply with protected areas and other legislation and plans and prevent further degradation. There is also great potential for restoring degraded areas. Nestled high in the slopes of the Andes, the ruins of Machu Picchu continue to reveal the mysteries of the Inca Empire. While the archaeological site draws scores of visitors to Pompeii annually, here are 10 lesser known secrets hidden beneath with layer of history. It is not actually the lost city of the Inca. When the explorer Hiram Bingham III encountered Machu Picchu in 1911, he was looking for a different city known as Vilcabamba. This was a hidden capital to which the Inca had escaped after the Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1532. Over time, it became famous as the legendary lost city of the Inca. Bingham spent most of his life arguing that Machu Picchu and Vilcabamba were one and the same, a theory that was proved wrong until after his death in 1956. The real Vilcabamba is now believed to have been built in the jungle about 50 miles west of Machu Picchu. Recent research had cast doubt on whether Machu Picchu had ever been forgotten at all. When Bingham arrived, 3 families of farmers were living at the Machu Picchu. The Inca Empire, also known as the Incan Empire and the Inca Empire, was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. The administrative, political, and military center of the empire was in the city of Cusco. The Inca civilization arose from the Peruvian highlands sometime in the early 13th century. The Inca civilization flourished in the ancient Peru between 1400 and 1533 CE, and their empire eventually extended across western South America from Quito in the north to Santiago in the south. It is the largest empire ever seen in the Americas and the largest in the world at the time. Undoubted by the often harsh environment, the Incas conquered people and exploited landscapes in such diverse settings as plains, mountains, deserts, and tropical jungle. Famed for their unique art and architecture, they constructed finely built and imposing buildings wherever they conquered, and their spectacular adaptation of natural landscape with terracing highway and mountain-top settlements continues to impress modern visitors at such world-famous sites as Machu Picchu. Historical overview. As with other ancient America's culture, The historical origins of the Incas are difficult to distinguish from the founding myths they themselves created. According to legend, in the beginning, the creator god Virukoa came out of Pacific Ocean, and when he arrived at Lake Titicaca, he created the sun and the all ethnic groups. These first people were buried by the god, and only later did they emerge from springs and rocks back into the world. The Incas specially were brought into existence at Tiwanaku from the sun god Inti. Hence they regarded themselves as the chosen few, the children of the sun, and the Inca ruler was the Inti's representative and embodiment on earth. In another version of the creation myth, the first Inca came from the scarred cave known as Tampa Teco, or the House of Window, which was located at the Pacarikuta, the Inn of Dawn south of Cusco. The first pair of humans were Manco Capac and his sister, also his wife, Mama Ocula. 3 more brother-sister siblings were born, and the group set off together to found their civilization. Defeating the Chance people with the help of stone warriors, the first Incas finally settled in the valley of Cusco and Manco Capac, throwing a golden rod into the ground, established what would become the Inca capital Cusco. 40,000 Incas governed a territory with 10 million subjects speaking over 30 different languages. More concrete archaeological evidence has revealed that the first settlement in the Cusco Valley actually date to 4500 BCE, when hunter-gatherer communities occupied the area. However, Cusco only became a significant center sometime at the beginning of the late intermediate period. A process of regional unification began from the late 14th century CE and from the early 15th century CE with the arrival of the first great Inca leader, Pachacuti Inca Ipukehi, was the defeat of the Cachaca 1438 CE. The Incas began to expand in search of plunder and production resources, first to the south and then in all directions. They eventually built an empire which stretched across the Andes, conquering such peoples as the Lupaca, Cola, Chimor, and Huanca civilizations. Long along the way, once established, a nationwide system of tax and administration was instigated, which consolidated the power of Cusco. The rise of the Inca Empire was spectacularly quick. First, all speakers of the Inca language, Quechua, were given privileged status, and this noble class then dominated all the important role within the empire. Thupa Inca Yupinuki, Pachuti successor from the 1417 CE, is credited with having expanded the empire by a massive 4,000 kilometers. The Incas themselves called their empire Tuanitisu, meaning land of the 4 quarters or the 4 parts together. Cusco was considered the navel of the world, and radiating out were highways and sacred signaling lines to each world. Spreading across ancient Ecuador, Peru, northern Chile, Bolivia, upland Argentina, and southern Colombia, the stretching 5,500 km north to south, 40,000 Incas governed a huge territory with some 10 million subjects speaking over 30 different languages. Government and administration. The Inca kept list of their kings so that we know of such names as Pachacuti Inca Yepunuki, Thupa Inca Yupunuki, and Huayna Quapaki. It is possible that 2 kings ruled at the same time and that queens may have had some significant powers. But the Spanish records are not clear on both points. The Sapa Inca was an absolute ruler, and he lived a life of great opulence, drinking from gold and silver cups, wearing silver shoes, and living in a palace furnished with the finest textiles. He was pampered to the extreme. He was even looked after following his death, as the Inca mummified their ruler stored in the Coricancha temple in Cusco. The mummies were in elaborate ceremonies, regularly brought outside wearing their finest regalia, given offering of food and drink, and consulted for their opinion on pressing steps. Inca rule was much like their architecture, based on compartmentalized and interlocking units. At the top was the ruler and 10 kindred group of nobles called Panaka. Next in line came 10 more kindred groups, more distantly related to the king, and then the third group of noble not of Inca blood but made Incas as a privilege. At the bottom of the stand upwards were locally recruited administrators who oversaw settlements and the smallest Andean population unit of Ailu, which was a collection of households, typically of related families, who worked an area of land, lived together and provided mutually support in time of need. Each Ailu was governed by a small number of nobles of Kurkas, a role which could include women. Local administrators reported to over 80 religion-level administrators, who in return reported to a governor responsible for each quarter of the empire. The 4 governors reported to the supreme Inca ruler in Cusco. To ensure loyalty, the heirs of local rulers were also kept as well as kept prisoners, all the Inca capital. The most important political, religious and military roles within the empire were then kept in the hands of the Inca elite, called by the Spanish the origins of big ears, because they wore large earrings to indicate their status. To better ensure the control of this elite over their subjects, garrisons dotted the empire, and the entirely new administrative centers were built, notably at Tamco, Colorado, Hunaco, Pampa, and Hatun, Jalisco. For tax purposes, and census were taken and the population divided up into groups based on multiples of 10. Inca mathematics was almost identical to the systems we use today. As there was no currency in the Inca world, taxes were paid in kind, usually foodstuffs, precious metals, textiles, exotic feathers, dyes, and spondylosous shell, but also in laborers who could be shifted about the empire to be used where they are most needed, known as mita service. Agricultural land and herds were divided into 3 parts: production for the state religion and the goods for the Inca ruler and for the farmers' own use. Local communities were also expected to help build and maintain such imperial projects as the road system, which stretched across the empire. To keep track of all these statistics, the Inca used the quick and sophisticated assembly of noted codes, which was also highly transportable and could record decimals up to 10,000. Although the Incas imposed their religion and administration on conquered peoples, extracted tribute, and even moved loyal populations to better integrate new territories into the empire, Inca culture also brought certain benefits such as food redistribution in times of environmental disaster, better storage facilities for foodstuffs, work via state-sponsored projects, state-sponsored religious feasts, roads, irrigation systems, terrace farms, military assistance, and luxury goods, especially art objects enjoyed by the local Cusco, the Inca capital of Cusco, meaning dried up lake bed, or perhaps derived from Cusco, a particular stone marker in the city, was the religious and administrative center of the empire and had a population of 150,000 at its peak, dominated by the scarred gold-covered and emerald-studded Coricancha complex. The greatest buildings were dedicated to Panchakuti. Most splendid were the temples built in honor of Inti and Kamakilia. The former was lined with 702 kg sheets of beaten gold, the latter with silver. The whole capital was laid out in the form of a puma, although the same scholar distribute this and take the description metamorphically, with the imperial metropolis of Pamakuchan forming the tail and the temple complex of forming the head, incorporating vast plazas, parklands, shrines, fountains, and canals. The splendor of Inca Cusco now unfortunately survives only in the eyewitness accounts of the first Europeans who marveled at its architecture and riches. The Inca religion. The Inca had great reverence for two earlier civilizations who had occupied most the same territory, the Wari and Tiwanaku. As we have seen, the sites of Tiwanaku and the Lake Titicaca played an important part in Inca creations. Miles and so were especially reversed. Inca rulers made regular pilgrimage and Tiwanaku and the island of the lake, where two shrines were built to the sun god and supreme Inca deity, and the moon goddess Mama Kilia. Also in the Coricancha complex at Cusco, these deities were represented by the large precious metal artworks which were attended and worshipped by priests and the priestless led by the second most important person after the king, the high priest of the sun. Thus the religion of the Inca was preoccupied with controlling the natural world and avoiding such disasters as earthquake, flood, and drought, which inevitably brought about the natural cycle of change, the turning over the time involving death and renewal, which the Inca called Panchakuti. Sacred sites were also established, often taking advantage of prominent natural features such as mountain tops, caves, and springs. These hookahs could be used to take astronomical observations at specific times of the year. Religious ceremonies took place according to the astronomical calendar, especially the movement of the sun, moon, and Milky Way. Processions and the ceremonies could also be connected to the agriculture, especially the planting and the harvesting seasons. Along with the Titicaca's inland of the sun, the most sacred Inca site was Panchacama, a temple city built in honor of the god with the same name, who created humans, plants, and was responsible for earthquake. A large wooden statue of the god, considered an oracle, brought pilgrims from across the Andes to worship at Panchacamac. Samanas were another important part of Inca religion and were active in every settlement. Cusco had 475, the most important being the Icarga, the personal advisor of the ruler. Inca religious rituals also involved ancestor worship as seen through the practice of mummification and making offerings to the gods of food, drink, and precious material sacrifices. Both animal and humans, including children, were also made to pacify and honor the gods and ensure the good health of the king. The pouring of libation, either water and chicha beer, was also an important part of Inca religious ceremony. The Incas imposed their religion on local population by building their own temples and sacred sites, and they also commanded sacred releases from conquered peoples and held them in Cusco. Stored in the Coricancha, they were perhaps considered hostages which ensured compliance to the Inca view of the world. Inca architecture and roads. Masterstone masons, the Incas constructed large building walls and fortification using finely worked blocks, either regular or polygonal, which fitted together so precisely no mortar was needed, with an emphasis on clean lines, trapezoid shapes, and incorporating natural features into these buildings they have easily withstood the powerful earthquakes which frequently hit the region. The distinctive sloping trapezoid form and the fine masonry of Inca buildings were, besides their obvious aesthetic value, also used as a recognizable symbol of Inca domination throughout the empire. One of the most common Inca buildings was the ubiquitous one-room storage warehouse of the Qualca. Built in stone and well ventilated, they are either round and stored maize or square for potatoes and tubers. The Kalanaka was a very large hall used for community gatherings. More modest buildings include the Cancha, a group of small single-room and rectangular buildings with thatched roofs built around the courtyard enclosed by a high wall. The Cancha was a typical architectural feature of Inca towns, and the idea was exported to conquer regions. Terracing, a maximized land area of agriculture, was another Inca practice, which they exported wherever they went. These terraces often include canals, as the Incas were expert at the diverting water, carrying it across great distance, channeling it underground, and creating spectacular outlets and fountains. Goods were transported across the empire along purpose-built roads using llamas and porters. The Inca road network covered over 40,000 kilometers, as well as following for the easy movement of armies, administrators, and trade goods. It was also a very powerful visual symbol of Inca authority over their empire. The roads had rest stations along their way, and there was also a relay system of runners who carried messages up to 240 kilometers in a single day from one settlement to another. Inca art, although influenced by the art and techniques of the Chimu civilization, the Inca did create their own distinctive style, which was an instantly recognizable symbol of imperial dominance across the empire. Inca art is best seen in highly polished metalwork in gold, considered the sweat of the sun, silver, considered the tears of the moon, and the copper, ceramics, and textiles, with the last being considered the most prestigious by the Incas themselves. Designs often use geometrically shapes, are technically accomplished and standardized. The checkboard stands out as a very popular design. One of the reasons for repeated designs was that pottery and textile were often produced for the state as a tax, and so artworks are representative of the specific communities and their cultural heritage. Just as today's coins and stamps reflect nation history, so too Andean artwork offered recognizable motifs which either represent the specific communities making them or the imposed design of the ruling Inca class ordering them. Works using precious metals such as dishes, jewelry, figures, and everyday objects were made exclusively for Inca nobles, and even some textiles were restricted for their use alone. Goods made using the super soft Vicuña wool were similarly restricted, and only in the Inca ruler could own Vicuña horse. Ceramics were the wider use, and the most common shape was the urub, a bulbous vessel with a long neck and two small handles low on the pot, which was used for storing maize. It is notable that the pottery, decorations, textiles, and architectural sculpture of the Incas did not usually include representation of themselves. Their rituals, such common Andean images and the monsters and the half-human, half-animal figures. The Inca produced textiles, ceramics, and the metal sculpture technically superior to any previous Andean culture, and this despite stiff competition from the master of the metalwork as the expert craftsmen of the Machu civilization. Just as the Inca imposed a political dominance over their conquered subjects, so too with the art they imposed standard Inca forms and designs. But they did allow local traditions to maintain their preferred colors and proportions. Gifted art such as those from Chanachan on the Titicaca area and women particularly skilled at weaving were brought to Cusco so that they could produce beautiful things for their Inca collapse. The Inca Empire was founded on and maintained by force, and the ruling Incas were very often unpopular with their subjects. Led by Francisco Pizarro, would take full advantage of in the middle decades of the 16th century CE. The Inca Empire, in fact, had still not reached the stage of consolidated maturity when it faced its greatest challenge. Rebellions were rife, and the Incas were engaged in a war in Ecuador, where a second Inca capital had been established at Quito. Even more serious, the Incas were hit by an epidemic and European disease, such as smallpox, which had spread from Central America even faster than the European invaders themselves, and the wave killed staggering 65 to 90% of the population. Such a disease called Huayna Quapic in 1528 CE, and two of his sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, battled in the damaging civil war for control of the empire. Just when the European treasure hunters arrived, it was its combination of the factors, a perfect storm of rebellion, disease, and invasion, which brought the downfall of the mighty Inca Empire, the largest and the richest ever seen in the Americas. The Inca language, Quechua, lives on today and is still spoken by some 8 million people. There are also a good number of buildings, artifacts, and written accounts which have survived the ravage of conquerors, looters, and time. These remains proportionally few to the vast riches which have been lost, but they remain indisputable witness to the wealth, ingenuity, and high cultural achievements of the great but short-lived civilization. This is all for today's video. If you want to see more videos, then please like, share, and subscribe my channel. Thank you.